The winter air was sharp, biting, and filled with the hum of anticipation. February 3rd, 1959, was a day destined to be forever etched in history, but no one at the time could have known the enormity of its mark. On that night, three rising stars of rock and roll, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper, Richardson, boarded the small, overcrowded plane, taking off into the dark skies with nothing more than dreams of their next gig. The ground beneath them was frozen, the snow on the ground thickening with each passing minute, but above them the air was already filled with the tension of the road ahead. The next chapter in their journey was to be written in the sky. But little did they know the chapter would end in a tragedy, changing the face of rock and roll forever. Buddy Holly, 22 years old, already a superstar with his own band and a string of chart-topping hits, was brimming with energy. His music had an edge, a rawness that spoke to a generation, and his influence was only beginning to grow. Ritchie Valens, just 17, was fresh-faced but with a voice that carried the soul of a much older man. His hit La Bamba was already a sensation, blending Latin rhythms with rock and roll, giving him a place in the limelight. And then there was J.P., the Big Bopper, Richardson, larger than life, both in size and personality. He had just tasted fame with his hit Chantilly Lace, a playful, flirtatious anthem, and his laughter could be heard all around the tour bus. They were on the Winter Dance Party tour, performing across the Midwest, but by the time they reached Clear Lake, Iowa, the grueling schedule had taken its toll. The bus they had been traveling in had broken down, the cold too much for the old vehicle to handle, and now the band needed to get to their next show in Fargo, North Dakota. The solution? A small plane, which would allow them to reach their destination faster and in more comfort than the crumbling bus. Holly, Valens, and Richardson would be joined by the pilot, Roger Peterson, a 21-year-old man with minimal flying experience in such conditions. The plane, a Beechcraft Bonanza, was small and cramped, not made for the conditions they were about to face. As the band settled in, the vibrations of the plane's engine seemed to hum with the kind of optimism that comes with a young career, the promise of what was yet to come. The pilot was young, inexperienced, and the weather was growing worse by the minute. But the music played on in their hearts. They took off, the hum of the engines, mingling with the sounds of anticipation and excitement for the show they would never reach. Buddy Holly had been at the forefront of rock and roll's innovation. His music, with its distorted guitars driving beats and melodies that felt as if they came from another dimension, had changed the face of popular music. He had redefined what it meant to be a rock star, and the world had only just begun to appreciate his impact. Ritchie Valens, too, had a unique style that blended rock with the cultural sound of the Latino community. At just 17, he had already created a lasting legacy, mixing his heritage with a sound that resonated with young people across America. And the Big Bopper, whose booming voice and vibrant personality had taken over the radio waves, was a figure that everyone in the industry knew and loved. But as the plane climbed higher into the night, everything began to go wrong. In the darkness of the sky, the plane flew straight into a storm. The weather turned swiftly, from simple flurries to a full-blown snowstorm, with wind gusts and swirling whiteouts that reduced visibility to almost nothing. What was once a joyous journey now seemed like a harbinger of doom. The pilot, Peterson, struggled with the controls. The small plane, already strained by the weight of its passengers and the worsening conditions, began to shake violently. Holly, ever the optimist, must have tried to reassure the others. But no one could escape the sinking feeling in their stomachs. They were fighting a battle against an invisible enemy, the storm. As Peterson battled to keep the plane steady, the snow, sleet, and high winds made it nearly impossible for him to fly straight. The plane's engines hummed and sputtered, the sound of metal against wind and ice. The young pilot was becoming disoriented, and the passengers in the back of the plane began to feel it too. Holly, Valens, and Richardson must have looked at each other in the dark, the bright lights of the instrument panels casting a haunting glow. Had they made the right choice? Were they about to face something they couldn't control? Suddenly, without warning, the plane lurched and banked steeply to one side. The engine sputtered in protest as the aircraft began to lose altitude rapidly. Richie Valens, who had already made the fateful decision to switch seats with Richardson earlier, must have looked around in panic. With the turbulence shaking the small aircraft, every second felt like an eternity. The young pilot, desperate, tried to regain control, but the plane was no longer responding. Buddy Holly, always a leader, must have tried to make sense of it, to calm those around him. He had no way of knowing that the next moments would seal the fate of the three young men, the plane, and the world of rock and roll forever. The plane began to spiral downward violently, as if the sky itself had claimed its victims. The music, the dreams, and the laughter from moments before were now drowned out by the terrifying sounds of a falling aircraft. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, there was silence. In the pitch black of the Iowa night, a violent thud shattered the silence, followed by the deafening sound of metal crumpling, shattering, and scattering across the frozen earth. The Beechcraft Bonanza crashed into a cornfield, leaving a fiery wreckage in its wake. The cold, silent landscape seemed to swallow the wreckage whole, and for a few moments there was nothing but the eerie quiet of the storm. For those who would later investigate, the wreckage was unrecognizable. The plane, once a small symbol of optimism and hope, now lay scattered in pieces across the field. The bodies of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson, and their pilot Roger Peterson were found among the twisted wreckage, their lives stolen in an instant. The crash site was miles away from where the plane should have landed, a somber and tragic confirmation that everything had gone wrong. The news of the crash reached the world the following morning. At first it seemed impossible. Such a tragedy was unthinkable for the millions of fans who had grown to love these musicians. Holly, Valens, and Richardson were the faces of a generation, and their music had become the soundtrack to so many lives. Buddy Holly's guitar riffs, Richie Valens' passionate renditions, and Big Bopper's larger-than-life stage persona were what drove the pulse of rock and roll at the time. Their deaths were an irreversible loss for the music world. When the reports began to emerge, the full weight of the tragedy started to settle in. The plane had gone down at around 1 o'clock a.m., crashing into the field, nearly a mile away from the nearest farmhouse. No one had heard it, no one except for the occasional echo of the howling wind. The shock of the accident reverberated far beyond the small town of Clear Lake, Iowa, where the plane had taken off. For people who had known the musicians, their loss was unfathomable. The search for the wreckage began immediately after the crash. Snow had blanketed the area, making it difficult for rescuers to get to the site. The terrain was rugged, covered in deep drifts and hard ice. The area was difficult to navigate even on foot, and the cold was so severe that it stung the face. Local police, search and rescue teams, and volunteers from Clear Lake worked through the early hours of the morning to locate the crash site, but by the time they found it, there was little hope left. When the bodies were discovered, the damage was devastating. Holly, Valens, and Richardson had all perished instantly, their dreams and futures ripped away. The pilot, Roger Peterson, was also found lifeless, his body showing signs of severe trauma. The world was reeling from the suddenness of it all. What seemed so clear in the beginning, that the young stars were on their way to greater success, was now clouded in darkness. Radio stations across the country quickly broke the news. Jays who had once played their hits were now announcing that those same voices would never again be heard on the airwaves. The heartbreak was palpable. It was as though the music had died, just as its brightest stars were beginning to burn the brightest. A moment in time, frozen forever. The shockwaves spread quickly, not just across America, but around the world. Their music had become the heartbeat of a generation, and the loss was felt by so many who had looked to them for guidance, inspiration, and the promise of a future of endless possibilities. Buddy Holly's death in particular hit the hardest. He was seen as the voice of his time, a true innovator in rock music. His hits like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day had defined a genre and given a voice to countless fans. He had pioneered a sound that would influence generations to come. His tragic end only deepened the sense of loss. But it wasn't just Buddy Holly's fans who mourned. Richie Valens had touched hearts across cultural lines. His hit, "A Bamba," was an anthem that not only crossed cultural barriers but also marked the fusion of Latin and rock music. In many ways, Richie was a symbol of the changing cultural landscape of America, where the sounds of the old world were blending seamlessly with the new. The fact that he was only 17 when he died only made his passing more tragic. What could he have accomplished had he lived? Would he have changed the music world even more? The questions lingered, but answers were in short supply. And then there was J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper. Larger than life, with a booming voice that could fill a room, J.P. had been a fan favorite, known for his humor and his catchy tunes. His death meant the loss of someone who had brought so much joy and light to people's lives. Fans would forever remember his iconic Chantilly Lace, a song that captured the playful spirit of the rock and roll era. The world had lost not just a musician, but a performer who embodied the joy of life. As the bodies were taken from the wreckage and sent for identification and autopsies, the world waited. The search for answers was inevitable. How had the plane crashed? Was it the weather, the pilot's inexperience? Or had something gone horribly wrong during the flight? For a long time, the world speculated, trying to make sense of the senseless. But no matter what the cause, the reality remained. The music was gone, and the world was left to grieve. The news of the crash spread quickly across the United States, and the nation was left to grapple with the loss of three brilliant young stars who had been on the cusp of greatness. The event marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of rock and roll, but it was one that would forever be tinged with sadness. The world was never the same after that night. The music had died. The loss of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson left a profound hole in the heart of rock and roll, but in the wake of their untimely deaths, something else began to take shape, a legacy that would live on forever. Though the crash marked the end of their physical presence, their music continued to reverberate throughout the decades, influencing countless artists, shaping genres, and creating a cultural memory that would never fade. The day after the crash, radio stations across the nation dedicated hours of airtime to playing the music of these fallen stars. For the next several days, that'll be the day, La Bamba and Chantilly Lace echoed across the airwaves as if their songs were the only things that could ease the pain of the loss. Fans, in mourning, would gather in front of jukeboxes and radios, trying to make sense of the tragedy. It was as if, in that moment, listening to their music was the only way to keep them alive, if only for a while. For Buddy Holly, the tragedy sparked a re-examination of his impact on rock and roll. In the wake of his death, it became clearer just how innovative he had been. His work, from his raw, distorted guitar riffs to his ability to blend pop, blues, and country influences, had transformed the way music was created and performed. He was a pioneer, unafraid to experiment with new sounds, to challenge the norms, and to push the boundaries of what was expected in the genre. His impact on the sound of rock and roll became undeniable. After his death, artists like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and many others openly credited Buddy Holly as a major influence on their own music. He had been the spark, the catalyst for an entire generation of musicians who would follow in his footsteps, making music that would shape the world for decades to come. Richie Valens, though his career had been short-lived, had already left his mark. His fusion of Latin rhythms with rock music created a sound that was both fresh and familiar, bridging cultural divides in a way few artists could. His hit, La Bamba, was more than just a song. It was an anthem for a generation that wanted to see itself represented in the mainstream. Valens was a symbol of the changing face of America, a Mexican-American teenager who had managed to find fame and success in the predominantly white world of rock and roll. He was a trailblazer, and though his life was cut tragically short, his influence on Latino music and the broader rock and roll movement continued to grow after his death. For the Big Bopper, his death marked the loss of a personality that could never be replaced. J.P. Richardson's charm, humor, and larger-than-life presence were a huge part of what made him so beloved by his fans. He wasn't just a performer. He was a character, a showman who knew how to make an audience laugh and enjoy themselves. His music may not have had the same lasting impact as Holly's or Valens in terms of innovation, but his ability to connect with people, to bring joy, laughter, and energy to the stage was a gift. His death meant the loss of one of the most charismatic performers of his time. In the months and years that followed the crash, the world of rock and roll mourned, but it also carried on. The industry was in shock, but the music that Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson had created could not be silenced. Their records continued to sell, their songs remained part of the soundtrack of America's youth, and new generations of listeners discovered their music. The crash may have taken them from this world, but it could not take away the power of their art. In 1959, the day the music died, the rock and roll world was forever altered. But what came after was an explosion of creativity, a wave of artists who took what Holly, Valens, and Richardson had done and built upon it. It was as if the genre itself had been rejuvenated by their deaths, as though their tragic end had unlocked a new era of rock music that would be forever shaped by their influence. One of the most significant legacies of that fateful day was the way in which the tragedy itself was mythologized in the years to come. The loss of three young stars, each of whom had so much left to give, created a sense of sorrow and reverence that would continue to grow in the public consciousness. The phrase, "the day the music died," coined by Don McLean in his 1971 song, American Pie, became a shorthand for a moment in time when the innocence of early rock and roll was lost and a more turbulent, uncertain future lay ahead. The song, with its melancholy lyrics and evocative imagery, captured the sadness and loss of that day in a way that resonated with listeners across the world. For many, it was a way to process the grief of losing these icons, but it was also a celebration of their lives and the music they had created. The legacy of "The Day the Music Died" became a rallying cry for fans of early rock and roll, a reminder that even in tragedy there is beauty, and even in death there is life through music. As the years passed, the memory of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper became part of rock and roll folklore. Museums, documentaries, and biographies were created to ensure their stories were never forgotten. Their music continued to inspire generations of artists, from the punk rock movement of the 1970s to the alternative bands of the 1990s and beyond. Each time someone picked up a guitar and played the opening chords of That, Be the Day or La Bamba, they were bringing their legacy back to life, keeping the music alive, and ensuring that the spirit of those young stars would never fade away. And so, despite the darkness of that cold February night, the music carried on. The crash may have stolen their lives, but it had not taken their legacy. In the end, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper became more than just icons of rock and roll. They became eternal symbols of the power of music to transcend time, to unite generations, and to remind us that even when the music dies, it can still live on.